He believed perfection was the only language loyalty understood, but he was about to discover that the most unexpected person could change an empire without ever trying. Adrian Castellano never remembered the names of his secretaries. There had simply been too many of them. Some lasted 5 days. Some barely survived 3. One ambitious executive assistant had proudly announced she could organize any billionaire's schedule, only to walk out before the end of her first week after realizing that Adrian expected absolute precision without excuses. Another had memorized every meeting, every contact, every preference, yet resigned after spending 6 days chasing a man whose life seemed to operate 24 hours ahead of everyone else's. Inside Castellano Global Holdings, people whispered about the position the way sailors whispered about dangerous waters. The office itself looked more like the headquarters of an international empire than a corporate building. Italian marble reflected the morning sunlight pouring through towering windows. Every polished surface seemed untouched by time. Every employee lowered their voice whenever Adrian's footsteps echoed across the hallway. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't loud. Somehow that made him even more intimidating. Adrian rarely repeated himself. He never raised his voice. His disappointment carried enough weight to silence an entire conference room. At exactly 8 a.m. every Monday, his secretary was expected to stand outside his office with the day's schedule already memorized, every document arranged perfectly, every possible problem solved before he even asked the question. By Friday afternoon, most of them were already searching for another job. This Monday was supposed to be no different. Human Resources had quietly placed another resignation letter inside a folder marked confidential. Nobody expected the newest hire to last any longer than the others. Naomi Carter arrived carrying a leather notebook that looked slightly too large for her arms. Her dark curls were neatly tied back, though several stubborn strands escaped almost immediately. She adjusted her glasses twice before reaching the reception desk, smiled nervously at the security guard, and thanked him after he handed her a visitor badge, even though it was simply his job. Several employees exchanged sympathetic glances. "Poor girl," one accountant whispered beneath his breath. "She has no idea where she is." Naomi heard none of it. She was too busy trying to remember which elevator reached the executive floor. By the time she finally stepped inside Adrian Castellano's private office carrying a tray with his freshly brewed coffee, her heartbeat felt louder than the ticking antique clock mounted against the walnut wall. Everything about the room reflected discipline. Shelves filled with perfectly aligned books. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. A massive mahogany desk with contracts arranged in flawless order. Adrian never looked up from the document in front of him. "Set it there," he said calmly. Naomi nodded too quickly. Her sleeve brushed against the edge of the silver tray. Time seemed to hesitate for one impossible second before the porcelain cup tipped forward. Hot coffee splashed across the polished desk, spreading toward a stack of signed contracts that represented months of negotiations. The sound of ceramics striking hardwood echoed through the office like a gunshot inside a cathedral. Outside the glass walls, conversation stopped instantly. Heads turned. One assistant quietly covered her mouth. Another employee slowly closed his laptop. Someone near the reception desk whispered, 8 minutes. That's all she lasted. Naomi stood frozen, staring at the spreading stain, her face draining of color as she realized she had just done what 13 secretaries before her had somehow managed to avoid on their very first morning. No one moved. The silence that settled across the executive floor felt heavier than the polished stone beneath Naomi Carter's shoes. She stared at the coffee spreading across Adrian Castellano's contracts, her hands trembling so badly she almost dropped the linen napkins she had instinctively reached for. Every instinct told her to apologize again, but something inside reminded her that repeating the same words would not undo what had already happened. She swallowed hard, picked up the broken pieces of the porcelain cup one by one, and quietly whispered, "I am sorry, sir." Adrian remained seated. His eyes followed the dark stain creeping across the edge of the documents before shifting toward Naomi for the first time that morning. They were calm, unreadable, almost unsettling in their stillness. Nobody outside the office could hear his breathing, yet dozens of employees watched through the glass walls, convinced they were witnessing another resignation before lunchtime. Adrian finally stood. His tailored charcoal suit looked untouched by the chaos surrounding him. Without raising his voice or showing the slightest hint of frustration, he looked directly at Naomi and said, "Clean it." That was all. 2 simple words. No lecture. No anger. No disappointment. He turned toward the windows overlooking downtown Chicago, as though the ruined paperwork mattered less than the city stretching beyond the glass. Naomi blinked, uncertain whether she had heard correctly. "Yes, sir," she answered softly before rushing to gather fresh towels from the private cabinet beside the conference room. Her hands still shook, but each movement became more careful than the last. She gently separated every document, drying each page without disturbing the signatures. Some ink had blurred beyond repair. She knew there would be consequences, even if none had arrived yet. Outside the office, whispers spread faster than breaking news. "Why has he not fired her?" one financial analyst murmured. "He dismissed a secretary for scheduling a meeting 15 minutes late," another replied. "She ruined signed contracts." Human Resources Director Evelyn Brooks quietly folded the resignation packet she had expected Naomi to sign before noon. Even she could not explain Adrian's reaction. For nearly 20 years, she had watched executives come and go, but Adrian Castellano never tolerated carelessness. Yet this morning, he had simply walked away. Naomi spent the next hour recreating files, organizing replacement folders, and contacting legal assistants to print backup copies. She never complained. She never blamed the slippery tray or her own nervousness. Whenever someone offered sympathy, she answered with a grateful smile before returning to work. Around lunchtime, she noticed the elderly maintenance employee struggling to push a supply cart through a heavy hallway door. Without hesitation, she hurried across the corridor and held it open. "Thank you, young lady," he said warmly. Naomi smiled. "Of course. Have a wonderful afternoon." She returned to her desk carrying another stack of documents almost twice her size. A few minutes later, she noticed the receptionist searching anxiously through several folders. Naomi quietly helped locate the missing file before slipping away without waiting for appreciation. She repeated the same kindness throughout the afternoon, answering phones for an overwhelmed assistant, helping the mail clerk sort overnight deliveries, and guiding a confused visitor toward the correct conference room even though she herself was still learning the building. Most people assumed she was simply trying to impress everyone after nearly losing her job. Adrian, however, noticed something different. From behind the partially open office door, he watched employees smile whenever Naomi approached. The atmosphere across the executive floor felt strangely lighter despite the disaster that had started the morning. For reasons he could not yet explain, the young woman who had made the biggest mistake of the day seemed completely uninterested in protecting her reputation. Instead, she kept finding quiet ways to make everyone else's day a little easier. Tuesday morning arrived wrapped in cold sunlight and quiet expectations. Several employees glanced toward Naomi Carter's desk before opening their computers, secretly surprised to find it occupied. She was still there. Someone in accounting smiled to himself and whispered that perhaps Adrian Castellano had simply forgotten to fire her. Others disagreed. Men like Adrian forgot nothing. Naomi carefully reviewed the day's schedule 3 times before walking toward Adrian's office with a fresh notebook held tightly against her chest. She paused outside the door, inhaled slowly, and knocked exactly once. "Come in," Adrian answered without looking up from the reports. Spread across his desk, Naomi stepped inside with measured caution, determined not to repeat yesterday's disaster. She placed the schedule neatly beside him and quietly summarized every meeting, every phone call, and every deadline. Halfway through the presentation, she accidentally skipped one appointment with a European investor. Realizing her mistake, she immediately stopped. "I apologize, sir. I missed one meeting." Adrian lifted his eyes from the document in front of him. Instead of correcting her himself, he waited. Naomi glanced down, found the missing note, and calmly continued without making another excuse. Adrian simply nodded once. "Continue." It was another response no one expected. Throughout the morning, Naomi remained busy moving between departments. She still struggled with unfamiliar filing systems and occasionally walked into the wrong office before politely excusing herself. Once she delivered contracts to the legal department instead of finance. Another time, she almost entered a conference room 15 minutes early before checking the schedule again. Every small mistake left her cheeks warm with embarrassment, yet she never blamed anyone else. She corrected each error immediately and kept moving forward. What stood out was not what she did wrong, but what she consistently chose to do afterward. When one of the junior assistants accidentally scattered hundreds of printed pages across the hallway after a folder slipped from his hands, several employees stepped around the mess because they were already late for meetings. Naomi quietly knelt beside him, helping organize every page in the correct order by matching tiny reference numbers printed in the corners. "Thank you," the young assistant said with visible relief. Naomi smiled gently. Everyone has difficult mornings. Later that afternoon, she noticed the cafeteria cashier searching through her purse with growing panic after realizing she had misplaced her apartment keys. Naomi stayed behind after lunch, helping retrace every stop until the keys were discovered beneath a folded receipt near the coffee station. She celebrated the discovery with genuine happiness, as though finding someone else's keys had made her own day brighter. Small moments like these began repeating across the building. The security officers learned her name because she always greeted them before entering. The cleaning staff appreciated that she pushed in chairs after meetings instead of leaving conference rooms in disarray. Even the mailroom supervisor noticed she thanked every courier who delivered packages. None of these gestures appeared on her job description. None earned recognition from senior management. Yet somehow they quietly reshaped the atmosphere around her. Adrian observed much of it without announcing his presence. His office overlooked the executive floor through discreet glass panels designed for privacy, without completely hiding activity outside. While reviewing contracts one afternoon, he noticed Naomi stopping beside an intern who looked overwhelmed by a complicated printer that refused to cooperate. Rather than taking over, she patiently read the instructions beside him until he solved the problem himself. She smiled, congratulated him, and walked away before he could properly thank her. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his attention drifting away from the financial report resting open before him. Every previous secretary had focused on impressing him. Promotions, praise, and personal ambition had driven nearly every decision they made. Naomi seemed almost unaware that he was watching it all. She continued making small mistakes that should have defined her performance. Yet somehow those mistakes faded into the background, while her quiet kindness became impossible to ignore. For the first time in many years, Adrian found himself wondering not whether his newest secretary would survive another week, but why the entire building already felt different because she had arrived. By Thursday morning, Adrian Castellano had stopped asking himself whether Naomi Carter would make another mistake. The answer was always yes. She still misplaced sticky notes, still carried too many folders at once, and still had an almost remarkable talent for bumping into the corner of the same filing cabinet every afternoon. Yet none of those things explained why his office had become noticeably quieter in the best possible way. The constant tension that usually settled over the executive floor seemed to dissolve whenever she walked through the hall, carrying another impossible stack of reports with an apologetic smile. Employees who once rushed past each other without speaking now paused to exchange greetings. The reception desk sounded less like a crisis center and more like the entrance to a company where people actually enjoyed working. Adrian noticed every detail because noticing details had built everything he owned. During the quarterly operations meeting, executives argued politely over financial forecasts while Naomi quietly refilled water glasses around the conference table. One vice president accidentally dropped his presentation folder just as he stood to speak. Charts, contracts, and handwritten notes scattered across the polished floor. Before anyone else reacted, Naomi knelt beside him, gathering every page in perfect order by matching the page numbers she spotted almost instantly. The executive thanked her with visible relief. She simply smiled and returned to her place near the wall, as though helping someone was no more important than breathing. Adrian watched the entire exchange without saying a word. After the meeting ended, he remained seated while everyone filed out. Naomi collected empty coffee cups from the table, humming softly to herself without realizing anyone could hear. It was an old melody, gentle and familiar, the kind someone might remember from childhood without recalling exactly where it came from. Adrian looked up from his notebook. "Miss Carter." She immediately stopped. "Yes, sir." "How many people asked for your help today?" The unexpected question caught her completely off guard. She blinked once before answering honestly. "I'm not sure, sir." "You are not sure?" She shook her head. "I did not count." Adrian studied her expression for several quiet seconds. There was no pride in her voice, no expectation of praise, only genuine confusion about why the question mattered. "You may go," he said calmly. "Thank you, sir." She picked up the last empty cup and disappeared through the doorway, leaving Adrian alone with thoughts he could not easily explain. Most people performed kindness when someone important was watching. Naomi behaved exactly the same whether anyone noticed or not. Later that afternoon, Adrian stepped onto the executive floor unexpectedly. Conversations immediately stopped. Chairs shifted. Computer screens filled with spreadsheets. It was the familiar reaction his presence always produced. Employees straightened their posture before he had spoken a single word. Then his attention settled on Naomi. She was standing beside the office printer helping an elderly courier replace a jammed paper tray. She laughed quietly after accidentally getting a small streak of blue ink across her fingertips. The courier laughed too. Neither of them realized Adrian was only a few feet away. It was not disrespect. It was simply that Naomi had become completely absorbed in making someone else's day easier. Adrian continued walking without interrupting them. But for the first time in years, he found himself looking not at quarterly profits or strategic reports, but at the expressions on people's faces. They smiled more often now. They greeted one another instead of avoiding eye contact. Even mistakes seemed to create cooperation instead of blame. That evening, after nearly everyone had gone home, Evelyn Brooks entered Adrian's office carrying several personnel files. "You wanted the employment records for the previous executive assistants?" she asked. Adrian nodded. Evelyn placed 13 folders across his desk. "Would you like me to prepare another recruitment search, just in case?" Adrian glanced toward the glass wall, where Naomi was still organizing tomorrow's schedule, completely unaware that anyone was watching her. She accidentally dropped a pen, laughed softly at herself, picked it up, and continued working with the same quiet determination she had shown since her first day. Adrian closed the stack of old personnel files without opening a single one. "No," he answered thoughtfully. "I believe this one deserves more time." Friday arrived with a steady summer rain tapping softly against the towering windows of Castellano Global Holdings, covering the city in a gray haze that blurred the skyline beyond the glass. Naomi Carter arrived 20 minutes early, as she always did now, carrying a small umbrella that had clearly seen better days. Before walking to her desk, she stopped by the break room, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and quietly left handwritten labels beside the regular and decaffeinated pots after noticing earlier in the week that several employees had accidentally poured the wrong one. Nobody asked her to do it. Nobody even knew who had started doing it. By 9 o'clock, the labels had already saved more than one sleepy executive from an unpleasant surprise. Adrian Castellano noticed them immediately. He noticed everything. Yet he said nothing, choosing instead to observe another ordinary day that no longer felt ordinary at all. Shortly before lunch, Naomi received a phone call. She glanced at the screen, and the warmth that usually rested behind her eyes disappeared for a brief moment. She stepped into the quiet hallway, lowered her voice, and answered with gentle patience. "Hello, Mom." Her smile returned almost instantly, but it sounded different now, softer, more protective. "Yes, I remembered your appointment next Tuesday. I already arranged to leave work a little early. No, you do not have to worry about me. I am eating well." She laughed quietly after hearing something on the other end. "I know you still think I forget lunch, but I promise I packed one today." She listened for several seconds before answering again. "The new job is going well. Everyone has been kind." It was a small kindness to protect her mother from unnecessary worry. Naomi never mentioned the spilled coffee, the sleepless nights, or the pressure of trying to keep pace inside one of the most demanding offices in Chicago. After ending the call, she closed her eyes for just a moment before taking one slow breath and returning to work wearing the same calm smile everyone had come to recognize. Later that afternoon, Evelyn Brooks stopped beside Naomi's desk, holding several personnel documents. "Your employee file is still missing a few records," she said pleasantly. "I noticed you graduated at the top of your class before leaving college. Was that a clerical error?" Naomi hesitated before shaking her head. "No, it was not." Evelyn looked surprised. "You never finished?" Naomi smiled politely. Life changed. She offered nothing more, and Evelyn respected the silence. But pieces of Naomi's story slowly became visible over the following hours. A framed photograph slipped from her notebook while she searched for a meeting agenda. Before Naomi could reach it, Evelyn gently picked it up. The picture showed a younger Naomi wearing a university sweatshirt beside an older woman seated in a wheelchair, both smiling beneath autumn trees painted bright shades of orange and gold. Naomi accepted the photograph carefully. "My mother," she explained quietly. "She is the strongest person I know." There was no sadness in her voice, only admiration. After Evelyn walked away, she could not help wondering how many dreams that young woman had quietly set aside without ever asking anyone to notice. Unknown to Naomi, Adrian had witnessed the brief exchange through the partially open office door. Later that evening, after the building had nearly emptied, he reviewed the personnel file Evelyn had finally completed. There were no awards highlighted in bold letters, no prestigious internships, no impressive list of influential connections. Instead, there was a simple timeline that quietly explained everything. Naomi had left college during her final year. Employment records showed a series of part-time jobs spread across hospitals, bookstores, neighborhood offices, and community centers. None lasted very long because every schedule revolved around one constant responsibility listed only once in a benefits application: primary family caregiver. Adrian closed the file slowly. For years he had measured people by efficiency, credentials, and flawless execution. Yet sitting alone inside the silent office, he realized the young woman who apologized every time she dropped a folder had spent years carrying burdens far heavier than paperwork. Suddenly her nervous hands, her occasional mistakes, and even her habit of saying she was sorry made perfect sense. And for the first time, Adrian did not see an inexperienced secretary struggling to keep up. He saw someone who had quietly sacrificed her own future so another person would never have to face life's hardest days alone. The following Monday began with unusual activity on the executive floor. Security officers spoke into their radios more often than usual. Assistants straightened conference rooms twice instead of once, and several senior executives adjusted their schedules after learning that Adrian Castellano's 8-year-old son, Ethan, would be spending the afternoon at the office while school remained closed for a teacher training day. Most employees had never met the boy. Those who had described him as quiet, intelligent, and cautious around strangers. Adrian rarely mixed family with business, but an important series of meetings left him with few alternatives. Shortly after 1 o'clock, Ethan arrived holding the hand of his father's longtime driver. He wore a navy sweater, carried a backpack almost half his size, and politely greeted everyone who smiled at him before settling into the private lounge connected to Adrian's office. Naomi noticed him only in passing while organizing meeting packets. She offered a warm smile. "Hello there." Ethan smiled shyly before looking back down at the book resting on his lap. The afternoon continued without incident until one unexpected interruption changed everything. A fire alarm system scheduled for routine maintenance suddenly emitted a brief series of loud test tones that echoed throughout the executive floor. Employees had been warned in advance, but Ethan had not. The sharp electronic sound startled him. He immediately covered both ears, squeezed his eyes shut, and began breathing much faster. Adrian excused himself from the conference room the moment he heard the alarm and hurried toward his office. Several employees stood nearby, unsure how to help without making the situation worse. Ethan remained frozen beside the sofa, overwhelmed by the sudden noise despite the alarm ending only seconds later. Adrian knelt beside his son. "Ethan, look at me." The boy wanted to respond, but struggled to slow his breathing. Concern quietly spread across the room. Naomi stepped into the hallway carrying a folder, immediately sensed something was wrong, and stopped several feet away. She did not rush forward. She did not interrupt Adrian. Instead, she remembered countless afternoons years earlier spent comforting her younger cousin Marcus whenever crowded places or unexpected sounds became too much for him. She gently placed the folder on a nearby table before lowering herself to Ethan's eye level, careful to remain far enough away that he would not feel crowded. Her voice stayed soft and steady. "Hi, Ethan. You do not have to look at me if you do not want to." The boy kept staring at the floor. Naomi nodded as though that was perfectly acceptable. Sometimes loud sounds make the whole world feel too big. "That is okay." Adrian looked toward her with quiet surprise, but chose not to interrupt. Naomi slowly placed one hand over her own heart. "Can you help me with something?" Ethan hesitated. I forgot how to count slow breaths. I think I need an expert. The corners of the boy's eyes shifted toward her for the first time. Naomi smiled gently. Can we breathe together? Just 4 slow breaths. She exaggerated one calm inhale, then one gentle exhale. Ethan watched carefully before trying to match her rhythm. The second breath came easier. The third steadied his shoulders. By the fourth, his hands slowly relaxed away from his ears. Naomi never reached for him or asked him to hurry. She simply remained present, matching each quiet breath with one of her own until the tension gradually disappeared from his face. After a long moment, Ethan looked up at his father and managed a small smile. Adrian released a breath he had not realized he had been holding. The conference room remained completely silent. Executives who negotiated multi-million-dollar agreements every day stood motionless, watching a young secretary accomplish in a few patient minutes what no amount of authority could have achieved. Ethan looked back at Naomi and whispered, "Thank you." She smiled with genuine warmth. "You did all the hard work. I just counted with you." Adrian's eyes lingered on Naomi longer than ever before. In that quiet moment, he understood something no business report had ever taught him. Strength was not always measured by control. Sometimes it appeared as simple patience offered exactly when another human being needed it most. The days that followed felt subtly different, although nobody could explain exactly why. The polished hallways remained the same. The conference rooms still filled with charts, forecasts, and impossible deadlines. Adrian Castellano still arrived before sunrise and often remained long after the city lights reflected across the glass towers of downtown Chicago. Yet something inside him had begun to shift so quietly that even he struggled to recognize it. On Tuesday morning, he entered the executive floor as employees instinctively stood a little straighter. That reaction had always satisfied him. Discipline built successful companies, and expectations separated excellence from mediocrity. But as he walked toward his office, his attention settled on a different scene. Naomi Carter had stopped beside one of the new interns, patiently explaining how to organize meeting folders by priority rather than alphabetically. She did not correct him with embarrassment or frustration. She simply smiled after he understood and said, "Everyone learns faster when they feel comfortable asking questions." Adrian continued walking, but those words stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Hours later, another opportunity appeared almost by accident. During a budget review, one of the junior analysts stumbled while presenting quarterly projections. His voice shook as he searched for the correct numbers, clearly overwhelmed by the room filled with senior executives. In the past, Adrian would have immediately interrupted and requested the next presenter. Efficiency had always come before confidence. Instead, he waited. The young analyst took a slow breath, found the correct page, and completed the presentation without another mistake. When the meeting concluded, Adrian simply nodded once and said, "Good recovery." The room became unexpectedly quiet. Several executives exchanged brief glances. Those 2 words carried more encouragement than many of them had heard from him in years. The change continued in small, almost invisible moments. One afternoon, Adrian passed the security desk and noticed Officer Ramirez eating lunch while reviewing visitor logs. Without thinking, Adrian paused. "Have you had a chance to take a proper break today?" The officer looked genuinely surprised. "Yes, sir. Thank you for asking." Adrian gave a short nod before continuing toward the elevators. Only after the doors closed did he realize he had never asked that question before. Later that week, Evelyn Brooks entered his office carrying employee satisfaction reports. "Something unusual is happening," she said with quiet amazement. "Absenteeism has dropped. Voluntary overtime has increased. Departments are cooperating more than they have in years." Adrian accepted the report without responding immediately. He already suspected the answer hidden behind those numbers. It had never been new software, stricter policies, or larger bonuses. It had begun with one person treating everyone around her as though they mattered. Meanwhile, Naomi remained completely unaware of the influence she was having. She still apologized whenever she made a small mistake. She still thanked the janitorial staff every evening before leaving. She still carried extra granola bars in her desk drawer because she had quietly learned which interns sometimes skipped lunch while adjusting to their first full-time jobs. She never announced these gestures. She simply noticed what others overlooked. Near the end of the week, Ethan visited the office again after school. This time he walked confidently through the executive floor, carrying a drawing folded inside his backpack. He approached Naomi's desk with a shy smile. "I made this for you." She carefully unfolded the picture. It showed three stick figures standing in front of a tall building beneath a bright blue sky. One was labeled Dad. One was labeled me. The third simply said Naomi with a small heart drawn beside her name. Naomi smiled, her eyes growing warm. "This is beautiful, Ethan. Thank you." Standing unnoticed just outside his office, Adrian watched the exchange in complete silence. He realized that for years he had believed respect was earned through flawless performance, absolute control, and relentless standards. Yet the person who had changed his company the most had accomplished it without power, without authority, and without asking anyone to admire her. She had simply chosen kindness every single day, even when nobody was watching. And somewhere along the way, she had reminded a man who had built an empire that people did not give their best because they feared a leader. They gave their best because someone first made them feel seen. Nearly 3 months had passed since Naomi Carter first walked into Castellano Global Holdings carrying a notebook that seemed too large for her hands. The office no longer measured time by quarterly reports alone. People quietly joked that there were 2 eras inside the company, before Naomi arrived and after. Even the newest employees sensed the difference without knowing why. Yet success often attracted attention from places no one expected. On a quiet Wednesday afternoon, Naomi stayed behind after a leadership meeting to organize folders left scattered across the conference table. As she gathered the last stack of documents, she noticed a sealed envelope tucked beneath a presentation binder. Assuming someone had forgotten it, she picked it up, intending to return it to the legal department. Before she reached the hallway, the envelope slipped from her hands. Several pages slid onto the polished floor. Naomi immediately knelt to collect them, careful not to read anything that was clearly confidential. As she aligned the pages by their page numbers, one paragraph caught her attention without her intending to see it. The document listed the same financial figures under 2 different company names, each scheduled for separate presentations only 2 days apart. Naomi frowned. She had spent weeks organizing executive calendars and recognized both meeting schedules immediately. Something did not fit. She quickly looked away, finished stacking the pages, and sealed them back inside the envelope exactly as she had found them. For the rest of the afternoon, the thought lingered quietly in her mind. By evening, she convinced herself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Still, before leaving for the day, she carefully compared the meeting calendar with the document routing log she maintained for Adrian's office. The dates matched perfectly. The recipients did not. One packet had somehow been addressed to an outside consulting firm that should never have received internal financial projections before the board approved them. Naomi stared at the screen for several silent seconds. She did not assume wrongdoing. She assumed someone had made an honest mistake. The following morning, she approached Evelyn Brooks first. "I think there may be a filing error," Naomi said gently, placing the routing log on her desk. Evelyn reviewed the records twice before shaking her head. "Everything appears normal." Naomi nodded politely, but the uneasy feeling remained. She spent another hour checking document tracking numbers against delivery confirmations. The more she looked, the less accidental everything seemed. Finally, she stood outside Adrian Castellano's office, hesitating before knocking. When he invited her inside, she quietly placed both folders on his desk. "Sir, I may be mistaken," she began carefully. "I hope I am. But I believe these documents were prepared for different recipients, and the routing history does not match the meeting schedule." Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he compared every page himself. His expression remained calm, but his attention sharpened with each passing minute. He pressed the intercom. "Please ask legal compliance to join us." Within the hour, the compliance team discovered that a simple administrative change made several weeks earlier had unintentionally redirected a small group of confidential planning documents into the wrong internal approval path before anyone noticed. Fortunately, the files had never left the company because Naomi questioned the inconsistency before the final distribution process began. The issue was corrected quietly that same afternoon without public embarrassment or financial consequences. During the debriefing meeting, several executives praised the updated compliance software for identifying the discrepancy. Adrian listened patiently before closing the report. The software did not. Find it, he said evenly. Every face turned toward him. He looked across the conference table until his eyes rested on Naomi, who seemed almost uncomfortable receiving attention. Someone who cared enough to notice did. The room fell silent. Naomi lowered her eyes with a modest smile, insisting softly that anyone could have found the mistake. Adrian knew better. Many people possessed intelligence. Many possessed experience. But very few combined careful attention with genuine responsibility for others. Once again, the person who believed she was simply doing her job had quietly protected an entire organization, not through authority or ambition, but because she refused to ignore something that did not feel right. 1 year later, the executive floor of Castellano Global Holdings looked almost identical to anyone walking through the front doors for the first time. The marbles still reflected the morning light. The elevators still opened with quiet precision. Meetings still began exactly on schedule. Yet the people inside carried themselves differently. New employees quickly learned that excellence was expected, but they also discovered something that had never appeared in any employee handbook. They mattered. Managers asked questions before making assumptions. Executives thanked assistants after long meetings. Security officers were greeted by name every morning. The culture had changed so gradually that no single person could point to the exact day it happened. They only knew that work no longer felt like a place where everyone feared making mistakes. It had become a place where people helped one another recover from them. Naomi Carter had changed as well. She still smiled at everyone she passed. She still carried an extra notebook because she somehow always found someone who needed one. She still apologized whenever she accidentally bumped into a chair or dropped a pen, and the entire office laughed with gentle affection because everyone knew she would laugh at herself first. But there was a new confidence in the way she walked through the building. She no longer questioned whether she belonged there. She had earned her place without ever asking for recognition. Her desk now stood just outside Adrian Castellano's office, not because she demanded the position, but because no one else understood the rhythm of the company or the people inside it better than she did. One autumn afternoon, a newly hired assistant nervously stood outside the executive office holding a stack of reports with trembling hands. Naomi immediately recognized the expression. It was the same fear she had carried on her own first day. She walked over with a warm smile and quietly helped organize the folders. "You do not have to be perfect," she said gently. "You only have to keep learning." The young assistant looked at her with visible relief. From inside his office, Adrian watched the exchange through the open doorway. A year earlier, he would have measured success by profits, expansion, and market share. Those achievements still mattered, but they were no longer the first things he noticed. He now paid attention to conversations in the hallway, to whether people felt comfortable asking questions, and to whether someone who was struggling had another person willing to help. Later that afternoon, the executive leadership team gathered to celebrate another successful year. During the reception, one senior investor approached Adrian while observing Naomi laughing with Ethan, who proudly showed her a certificate he had earned at school. "You have remarkable people working for you," the investor said. "That young woman has become the heart of this company." Adrian looked across the room before answering. She became the heart of this company long before anyone realized it. A few moments later, another executive asked the question many had quietly wondered for months. "Out of everyone who has worked beside you, why do you trust her more than anyone else?" Adrian smiled faintly, the kind of smile that appeared only on rare occasions. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched Naomi congratulate the new assistant for successfully finishing her first week. Then he spoke with calm certainty. Everyone before her tried to prove they were exceptional. She spent her time making everyone else feel capable. That is the kind of person you build a future around. The room grew still as his words settled over everyone present. Naomi looked up, surprised to find so many eyes turned toward her. She smiled with the same quiet humility she had carried from the very beginning, unaware that the greatest measure of her success had never been the title on her office door. It was the kindness she had repeated so consistently that it became part of the building itself. Adrian raised his coffee cup in her direction with a small nod of gratitude. Naomi returned the gesture with a warm smile, and in that simple exchange no promotion, award, or speech could have carried greater meaning. On that quiet afternoon, surrounded by people who had learned to see one another a little more clearly, The company celebrated far more than another successful year. It celebrated the truth that genuine strength does not begin with power, wealth, or authority. It begins with choosing compassion when no one expects it, offering respect before it is earned, and remembering that every person carries a story invisible to everyone else. And that day, everyone in the room remembered what dignity truly looked like.